When Morgan Freeman appears on screen, everything around seems to freeze. His voice is like the whisper of the universe, old and wise, knowing just a bit more than it should. He doesn't state, he asks questions. Questions humanity has pondered for centuries. What awaits us on the other side? Is there a continuation after the final breath? Or does everything end like a light switched off in an empty room? Morgan Freeman is not the first to take on this topic. But he is one of the few who can speak of death as if he's telling a story about life. He doesn't scare, doesn't impose, doesn't lead into esoteric thickets. He seeks. And together with him we seek as well. 7 billion people on the planet. And every one of them, without exception, has at least once fallen asleep with the thought, what if? What if death is not an end, but a transition? A door we cannot open while alive. But it can be studied by traces. By stories of those who were on the edge. By the traditions of ancient peoples. By scientific data. By mystical accounts. Freeman approaches this question not as a scientist, not as a priest, but as a wise observer. He listens. In one of the episodes, he says, if you knew what awaits you beyond this life, would you live differently? And from that moment begins a true odyssey. We follow him to Tibetan monasteries, where monks meditate for hours on the image of their own death. Then to a clinic in the United States, where patients who survived clinical death described the same corridor of light, the same strange music. Coincidence? Subconscious? Or is the veil really being lifted for us? In Vietnam, he meets a woman who claims to remember her past life. She recounts details, names, events. Everything checks out. Scientists throw up their hands. Coincidence? Deception? Or a consequence of the soul truly not dying? Freeman doesn't rush to conclusions. He doesn't seek answers, he seeks the right questions. And that is his strength. He doesn't promise to show heaven or hell. But he goes where no one wants to look. Into the very essence of the fear that lives inside each of us, the fear of disappearance. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe death is the beginning? Freeman says, everyone is afraid of death. But maybe we fear not the end, but that after it we will become someone else. Or, no one. And in that phrase everything. Doubt. Hope. And a light, almost elusive shadow of truth. Freeman sits in the half-light of an old library, behind him shelves lined with dusty folios, books that are several hundred years old. The camera slowly moves in, and he, without looking into the lens, says, maybe we're looking in the wrong direction. We search for life after death, but perhaps death is just a part of one endless life? Thus begins the next episode. This time, he heads to Egypt. The Great Pyramids, burial chambers, ancient texts carved in stone. The Egyptians believed death is a journey. They prepared for it their whole lives. Their Book of the Dead is not about an end, but about a voyage. They weren't afraid to die, because they were certain it is merely a step beyond the threshold. Freeman looks into the face of the statue of Osiris and says, too much has humanity forgotten. We stop dying with dignity. We hide death. Yet it is not an enemy. It is a mirror. It is an exam. It is a question awaiting an answer. Then he meets a female scientist. She has spent years studying the phenomenon of so-called near-death experiences. She shows him brain scans taken during clinical death. She tells of patients who saw from above their own body, heard the doctor's conversations before they even happened. How could they know? The brain dies, she says, but consciousness seems to go beyond it. Freeman listens. And slowly nods. He does not agree, he acknowledges. He travels to America. There, in one of the churches, a preacher with fire in his eyes speaks of heaven and hell. Black and white. Paradise and damnation. Punishment and reward. People in the audience nod. For them, everything is clear. They don't want questions, they want answers. Simple. Reliable. But Freeman once again doesn't take sides. He merely says, faith gives strength. But what if the truth is more complicated? What if beyond there is not judgment, but understanding? He meets a woman who survived clinical death. She describes flying through a dark tunnel, feeling a world where there is no pain, no time. There were those she loved and had long lost. But then she was called back. She woke up. In tears. Not from fear, from longing. Freeman looks at her and asks, "Do you believe it was just a dream?" She smiles and replies, "If it was a dream, then let all of life be a waking from it." Morgan Freeman doesn't tell the viewer to believe these stories. He simply collects them like artifacts. One by one. Assembling a mosaic. And the further it goes, the clearer it becomes, this mosaic is more than just humanity's fear of the end. It is a mirror of who we have become. The intrigue builds. The more voices there are, the less certainty remains. And yet, something common begins to emerge. A motif. A thread. The light at the end of the tunnel is not just a metaphor. It appears in the stories of children, the elderly, people of different cultures, different religions. They couldn't all be lying. Or, could they? Freeman walks along a deserted road. The camera, from above, shows the landscape dusty, scorched, yet beautiful. In his voice weariness, but also curiosity. He says, "We think we know where life begins and where it ends. But what if we're wrong? What if the boundaries are an illusion?" He visits a laboratory where a group of neurophysiologists studies the state of consciousness at the moment of death. One of the scientists shows him charts. Here the heart has stopped. After 1 minute, zero activity. But here, he points to a spike, something happens. The brain seems to flare up. As if it lights up before going out forever. This flash is a mystery. They can't explain it. What is it? The dying brain's final effort? Or the moment of transition? And if it is a transition, then to where? Next, a conversation with a shaman in the Amazon. By the fire, amid the sounds of the night forest, he says, "Death is not an enemy. It is a spirit. It comes not to take, but to guide. You become part of the great circle. You return to the earth, to the wind, to the water." Freeman listens and asks a question that sounds like a bell toll. And what happens to the one who was evil? Where does he go? The shaman looks him in the eye and says, "Evil is a sickness of the soul. And death is the healing. But it will hurt, deeply." There's something in these words. Not just philosophy, but ancient logic. Perhaps the afterlife is not judgment, but a process. A cleansing. A transition. And not everyone is let through right away. Some are sent back. Some are left to wander. Freeman cites statistics. More than 40% of people who experienced clinical death speak of meeting something, a being, a figure, a light, a voice. Sometimes frightening. Sometimes loving. Almost no one feels alone. And yet loneliness is the greatest fear of a dying person. He reads an excerpt from a letter written by a soldier on the front lines in Vietnam, one day before he died. "If I die tomorrow, I hope I'll meet my mother. And if no one is there, let there be light. I don't want darkness. I don't want an end. This letter, says Freeman, is like a prayer. But it was written by a man who wasn't religious. That's the essence. Even an atheist, standing on the edge, doesn't want to disappear, he wants to be met. Recognized. Heard. In one of the most poignant moments, he stands by the ocean. Waves crash against the rocks. And the voiceover says, maybe at the moment of death, we hear silence for the first time. Not the kind that frightens, but the kind that says, everything is fine. Everything was not in vain. Freeman doesn't offer hope. He doesn't trade in comfort. He simply opens a door. Slowly. Cautiously. And we look into the darkness, waiting for the light. Morgan Freeman sits by the window. Outside evening, the red sun slowly sinking beyond the horizon. He speaks calmly, almost in a whisper. We fear death because we don't know what it's like to be dead. But maybe, we already were. Before birth. This thought seems to hang in the air. We're used to thinking everything begins with the first breath. But what if everything is a circle? What if life is not a straight path, but a wheel? He travels to India. There, death is part of life. There, on the banks of the Ganges, bodies are burned, and ashes given to the river, so the soul can continue on. He speaks with an old man who is preparing for his own funeral. The man smiles. This is not sorrow. This is liberation. Death is not the problem. The problem is to live life in vain. Freeman notes, the closer a person is to the end, the less fear they have. Why? Because death doesn't frighten those who understood why they lived. That becomes the central theme. He returns to America, to a hospice. There he meets a woman named Linda. She has a few weeks left. She is calm. She says, I feel the world pulling back. As if the walls are getting thinner. And behind them, someone is there. Not frightening. Calm. He waits. Doesn't rush. But he waits. Linda's words aren't a confession. They are the passing on of an experience. The kind that cannot be bought, studied, or understood in advance. Only lived through. Freeman thoughtfully says, maybe we're too focused on what we're going to lose. But we should think about what we're going to find. He speaks of love. Of how almost everyone who has been there says one thing: they felt loved. Unconditionally. Without fear. Without judgment. He lifts his eyes to the camera and asks the viewer, when you die, do you want to be greeted with reproach or with open arms? A pause follows. And in that pause, an entire abyss. He recalls the story of a boy who survived clinical death after a severe injury. The boy draws what he saw: vivid colors, a field, a strange light. It was home, but not like ours, he says. I wasn't scared. I knew it was right. Freeman slowly flips through the drawings. One by one. He doesn't analyze. He simply shows. And then he does something he used to avoid. He shares something personal. He says he has lost loved ones. That every time he said goodbye, he felt as if someone else was there. Something unseen. Maybe I want to believe in it, he says. But maybe. I felt the truth. 400 words and not a single answer. Only movement. In a spiral. Toward the center. To the point where words end and silence begins. Morgan Freeman stands in front of a mirror. His reflection is not just a physical image. It is the image of a man who has looked into the place most are afraid to face. His voice sounds softer, but stronger. When I was a child, I thought death was black emptiness. Today I think differently. I think death is a meeting with who you truly are. He turns to the camera and says, all of us are afraid. Afraid of pain. Afraid of the unknown. But more than anything, we're afraid that there is nothing. Emptiness. Silence. Oblivion. But what if it's not like that at all? The final frames a montage. Faces of different people. The elderly. Children. Believers. Skeptics. Scientists. Shamans. Nurses. Soldiers. People who were close to death. People who survived it. And in every look, something that cannot be put into words. Freeman says, if death were the end, why is it so multifaceted? Why does everyone who looked into it speak of light, of love, of presence? Why do we want to die not alone, but with someone's hand in ours? The camera shows him walking along the shore. Waves wash over his feet. Wind. Sand. Peace. I don't know what awaits us, he says. And maybe that's good. Not knowing means seeking. And seeking means living. He finds the final words. Quietly, without pathos. The way only he can. Perhaps beyond life there is no heaven. No hell. No streets of gold. But maybe there is understanding. Forgiveness. Answers. Silence without fear. Where you are no longer alone. And if that is so, isn't that enough to live with faith that it all has meaning? The final seconds, he looks into the distance. The sun sets. Everything slows. The sound fades. Only one question lingers in the air. And what if death is not a question, but an answer? And in that moment, you want to go silent. Just sit in the stillness. Because sometimes, the most important thing is not what was said, but what remains after.